If you are a parent watching us this morning, you are certainly well familiar with the stress of having the kids out of school while you are all stuck inside your home. You might even be working a full shift from home, and that is not going to change anytime soon. We've heard already just yesterday, Ontario, Manitoba, PEI, the closure of schools have been extended. In Ontario, they won't be in class until May the 4th. Same thing in PEI, extended, and that date could be pushed back further. Manitoba has said it's not committing to a return date at all.
Manitoba's K-12 schools will have their in-school classes suspended indefinitely for this school year.
These are extraordinary times. We're moving quickly with two aims in mind. The first is to keep your child safe, and the second is to keep them engaged in learning.
Hey guys, what are you doing?
So the provinces are increasing resources for at-home education. We're seeing that across the country. Manitoba, for example, planning to announce additional supports in the coming weeks. And in Ontario, a new teacher-led program is being launched to help students learn better from home. And that is the backdrop. So what a timely... Oh, let's listen in to Ontario for just a moment.
What I found most frustrating is when this first started, the government sent out their phase 1 plan, and it was really a non-plan. They sent out a bunch of links, and they effectively turned us all into teachers.
What we did hear from Nova Scotia this week, one of a growing number of provinces, that students who were set to graduate this year will still do so. But that's the backdrop as provinces confront the education reality setting in for parents and kids. And in answer to your questions, we know this is a big concern to you. So we are connecting you with someone who knows a whole lot about learning. Her name is Joanne Dominico. She's a learning strategist at Centennial College. She has her own personal learning brand called Study with Joanne. So that's exactly what we're going to do for the next 4 hours. Good morning, Joanne, and thank you for being our guest expert this morning.
Good morning, Heather. Thank you so much for having me.
We are going to be bombarded with questions for you, I know, because we can tell this is a big point of concern for families. And let's just be honest, there are millions of families right now in a situation they never imagined, with the schools closed and the kids at home for the foreseeable future. And you see this on mommy groups online, what difficult times these are. They're frustrating, they're frightening, and there's guilt and uncertainty. That's just my assessment as I look at what's out there. You know this so well. What's your overarching view of what is before parents right now?
My overarching view is that parents are faced with a lot of change and a lot of challenge all at once. And it can be really difficult for them to decide what they should be doing and how they should be navigating this new online learning landscape. So my first piece of advice to parents is to just try to remain positive as you navigate it, because one thing I know about kids is they really feed off your energy. So you want to remain positive and upbeat as you try to figure everything out. Fortunately, there's a lot of resources available.
Well, those are the kinds of things that we're going to talk about over these 4 hours with our viewer questions, because I want to look at those resources. How on earth do you stay calm with all of this going on? I was looking at your most recent blog post, and there are 5 tips right there for even setting up the space where kids will work at home. So why don't we start there by taking us through those just briefly, in terms of, because do you have a desk? Do they have a special like school area? Do they work at the kitchen table? Yeah. How do you set up the space effectively?
Yes, that's a great question. So I believe that first and foremost, children should choose a designated study space that is not the bed or the couch, and especially for older students who may be tempted, because your brain associates your bed with sleep, and the last thing you want to be doing while you're attending an online class or doing some studying is dozing off. So choose a space where you can sit upright, that's well lit, and that can really help you to feel more alert and focused. Really, really important.
Ergonomics count, even in the homework space.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. And I had a friend who's complaining, oh, my back is hurting. And I asked her, where have you been studying? On the couch. So I said, yeah, you need a table. So the kitchen table and the dining room table are great options if you do not have a desk in your home. So making sure it's well lit as well, especially if you're studying early in the morning or late at night, because again, we don't want to feel sleepy. And then studying away from other people if you can, because now we're all quarantined at home. And if you have other people around you, it could be distracting. And one of my most important tips is not having your cell phone with you. If you're studying from your cell phone, that's one thing. You'll want to turn off notifications. But if you're studying from a computer or laptop, then having your cell phone in another room can really help to ensure you're much more productive.
A little more focused on the task at hand, as you would be if it were a school environment. That's interesting. That's a small screen. I want to talk about screen time with you, bigger screens and things over the course of the morning. But that's a great starting point for us. So you need a designated workspace that the child, the student, chooses him or herself to be as productive. You know, we've already had a viewer question, so I'm going to jump to that. I'll come back to some of my own musings in a second, but I want to get right to Lydia, who writes about special needs kids who have speech, physio, occupational therapy on a daily basis. How do they continue with their education and their learning? That's a great question.
It is a great question. And I actually was talking to a special ed teacher yesterday to find out her perspective. And she told me that the schools are going to be reaching out to their students, and that starting April 6th, a lot of these services will be available potentially virtually. So some of the workers that worked with the school board will be reaching out to their students and sending online lessons and virtual appointments. So I'm hoping that that will be something that will be able to support these parents in need.
Okay, and that's for Ontario. So one would think that other provinces doing something similar. Okay, so how do parents in general view this role they're taking on? I mean, it's almost like they're being asked to be suddenly expert homeschooler, and that's a lot to assume.
Yes, it is. And, you know, you have to keep in mind, too, that teachers have gone to school to get their education in how to train and educate youth, right? And so we don't expect our parents to be teachers. We do expect them to try to engage their children in some learning. But my advice is just do the best you can. There's a ton of resources sent from the school board, from the schools, and maybe even from the teachers directly. So figuring out what works best for you and your child, and remembering that all schools are closed right now. So your child is in the same boat as every other child. So typically when school's on, most of the students' goals are grade-based goals. You know, I want my child to get this grade in science or math or English. Right now is a good time to work on habit-based goals, like have my child doing a little bit of reading every day, have my child spending a little less time on their screen, unproductive screen time usage, and more time doing productive educational things. So I think parents not feeling guilty that they're not, homeschooling for 5 hours a day, because the recommendations are 1 hour per day for a total of 5 hours for kids in elementary school, and double that for high school. So it's not that your student is expected to be studying for 5-6 hours a day.
That's really interesting. That's the formula that you would suggest, 1 hour a day and then 2. I had read somewhere, and some other experts suggesting half an hour for every grade. So that gets really up there if you're into high school. That's a full day of lessons, really. So you're suggesting that it is possible to have a very productive student at home with a lot less time. But I really like that idea, because I'm thinking about parents kind of being hard on themselves for not being perfect in this role, and there could be a lot of guilt. So they need to manage expectations, I suppose, in a certain way.
Yes, exactly. And knowing your child as well. And that's why I recommend, if the child is younger, then you can have some more structure and schedules in place for them. If, in my experience, young children thrive off that routine. But for the older students, giving them a little more autonomy and flexibility, which will help with their motivation as well, saying you have to get in some academic time, but it's your choice when that gets done during the day.
We're going to talk structure and setup and everything over the course of the morning, but I want to jump right to a couple of really key questions. Farah writes, wondering, we don't have time to do online learning or distance learning because her husband and she are still working. So they're in this working from home situation. They have a baby. They have a daughter who is 6 and in grade 1, who is very independent. She has to do some writing and learning as well. So what would you suggest for parents who are trying to balance all of this, their own work responsibilities with parenting and educating?
Yes, it's sort of like we're wearing 3 hats now, right? Teaching, working, and parenting. My advice for that, because I'm actually working from home as well, and what my husband and I do is we have shifts. So I will be doing work and he will be working with my son and then lunchtime I will come down and kind of take over. So I recommend, if that is possible, to do some shifts so that one parent can work. I also do recommend, parents have been asking me, is it okay to have a little bit more screen time so that my child can be occupied while I'm working? And I do recommend that if you're doing that, then why not make some of that screen time more educational? So there's lots and lots of resources available now, whether it's on a laptop or a computer or on a television, where the students can be engaging in educational resources that are allowing the parents some time to do their work as well.
Okay, screen time. That was going to be a question. So you've raised it. Yes, some of it educational, but how do you feel about just non-educational screen time and whether more of that should be allowed at this particular unusual moment for us?
Yes, I think we have to all consider that this is a time where we have to allow for some flexibility. My advice, based on my experience working with students of all ages, is that your motivation and willpower is highest in the morning. Those are depletable resources that can decrease as the day goes on. So getting your children to do some academic work earlier in the day may be more beneficial. And then later on in the afternoon is when then they can choose what they would like to watch. So, you can be lenient with those screen time guidelines at this stage, because we really don't have much of a choice if that's what you're working with.
Exactly. And for the foreseeable future, I think there's a good measure of child psychologist in with your learning expert as well, Joanne. You're understanding this very well. I was going to ask about technology, and we have a question that specifically goes to that point. Stephanie, thank you for it. She has a very particular situation. 4 children of her own, 11, 13, 14, and up to 22, and then a 15-year-old who's living with them. And they are a modest family, she said, and they've tried to raise their children to be, people who enjoy the outdoors, who are not so connected to the phone and to technology. So they don't have modern technology. They have kind of an old and slow iPad, she says, an ancient desktop computer that lags all the time. That's by choice. But we also know, Stephanie, that you think of rural Canadian families, you think of families who don't have the means, who don't have the technology or the internet connection. What do they do when they don't have access to technology?
Well, that's a great question. And I know that many school boards are reaching out and sending surveys to families to see what their technology needs are. And then they will be hopefully working with the families to see if they can help get families some resources, whether that's loaning them newer computers or laptops and helping them to establish Wi-Fi connections. So that's one thing. So if you have not been in contact with your school, I would suggest you reach out because I do know that several provinces have been sending out the surveys. My second piece of advice too is I really believe that there's learning available all the time with all situations, even without technology. So using the resources you already have at home, and maybe that's books, maybe that's television, and maybe when you go for a walk in nature, you're learning about the nature and talking about it with your children. So, and there's life skills. Life skills is a great one too. There's so much value in cooking, for example, with your kids, with the measurements, with following a recipe. So just, I think, thinking outside of the box and being really creative with how you can incorporate some engagement in learning during this time.
Outside the box. That is fantastic. It doesn't have to be something that is on that screen. You were mentioning in the last hour, I think it bears repeating for anybody just joining us, how much time do you recommend that parents force their children to spend on lessons, formal lessons?
Yes, well, there will be some recommendations. We're starting to get more and more from the school boards. The latest that I've seen from my province is for K-3, kindergarten to grade 3, it's 5 hours per week. So that's 1 hour a day up to 5 hours per week. And they do recommend that the focus is on literacy and math. For grades 4 to 6, it's the same 5 hours a week, but they're also incorporating science and social studies for the recommendation. And then for grades 7 and 8, it's doubled. It's 10 hours a week. And then once we get into high school, it's actually 3 hours per course per week, if that's semestered. And then if it's non-semestered, it's 1.5 hours per course per week. So these are good gauges that parents can look to follow. And again, the resources online will give you some further guidelines as to what content you can be focusing on. I believe some will be teacher-led. There may be live virtual class with teachers, and some may be sent to you and you have to engage in some self-study or with some support from parents or by yourself.
Yes, I think those are going to start really ramping up as of next week as we see this being pushed further and further out. You mentioned that maybe the best time is to get the kids to sit down and do those educational screen activities in the morning. But overall, how structured do you think you should be? Should there be sort of like a set routine as they would have if they were going to school?
Yes, I do believe that. I believe that younger students thrive on routine, and I feel that having that established structure will work really well for them. I've been doing it with my son, even from the beginning. When it was March break, I set up a schedule with him because you know your child, and I knew that my child would have difficulty if I let him watch TV all day, every day for a week, and then told him, okay, now you have to do academic time. So we made the schedule from the beginning, and I think the key here is involving your child in the process of creating that schedule. Like, we're going to do academic time in the morning with no screens, and that's when mommy wants you to work on maybe math and the literacy. And then in the afternoon, we're going to do academic time with screens, but you get to choose which game you like. He loves his certain apps that he's already familiar with, and so he gets to look forward to that. So having that balance and letting the child choose some of their activities in the schedule can really help to increase their motivation.
Lots of excellent viewer questions, but I think I want to begin with one of our own CBC family, Charles Agro. I don't know if you know her, Joanne, but she is one of our hosts on Marketplace, and she's at home on mat leave with a 7-month-old. Her question will pertain to a lot of families because she would like some ideas, play ideas, learning ideas for the littlest ones that don't include screens. We've talked about screen time already this morning. She's reluctant to dive into screen time with such a young one, and she'd love some non-screen suggestions for you or from you.
Okay. Yes. Well, that's a great question as well. And I think babies, toddlers learn through play. Play is the best way for them to learn. So any opportunity to play with them, to engage with cause and effect things, fine motor skills, lots of ideas there. Again, online you can find a ton of resources with ideas, but just use your everyday play with them to and don't feel guilty about any additional learning. Play is learning for those little ones for sure.
Would like to thank Kate for this one. We talked earlier in the morning about how maybe our goals need to shift, not so much worried about marks and definite things to attain as you would in the normal school environment. But this is a specific question from Kate for grade 12s who are set to graduate and hoping to go to university, who actually need content as opposed to just staying engaged mentally. So high school students, in Kate's view, more motivated by grades, and assessments are very valuable for motivating them. So her question is, how can parents engage productively with teachers about assessment and creating at home learning structures that will ensure that the grade 12s particularly are set up for success post-secondary?
Yes, that's a great question as well. And I have combed through our resource sent from our province called Learn at Home, and they have an excellent site for high school students, and it's called Keep Up With Your Studies. And on that, they have links to all the different courses, applied and advanced levels, where students can go through and access the content. So I would recommend, based on the recommendations that have been given to us, that the students are spending 3 hours per course per week on those subject areas. And I also would recommend doing some practice testing. So setting up an environment that would be similar to how you may be assessed. So if it's going to be an open book online test, then actually practicing doing that. Usually textbooks at the end of every chapter have some study questions for review. So you could use those, or you can make up your own sample questions and even time yourself. So put yourself in the exact same environment that you would be when you actually have your test can be really good practice.
Excellent counsel. One more for this particular exchange, Joanne, and it's from Mimi, similar to one we talked about earlier in the morning, but I think it bears repeating because Mimi's situation is one which many families are in. She has a 4-year-old, an active boy. She has an 18-month-old who thinks she's a 4-year-old, and then 2 working parents who are taking shifts, as you suggested, but 2 working parents working from home. So how do you balance all of that, keep the littlest one happy, but also make sure that the 4-year-old gets some early learning in?
Well, that's a great idea. And one thing that I've come across is Khan Academy actually has sample schedules for all age groups. So you can make a schedule with the little one and one for the older one, and then just have some common times where the family does stuff together. So as I mentioned earlier, I believe that academic time in the morning is better when motivation and willpower are highest. And then in the afternoon is when you have more family time, when you're engaging in activities together. So in my home, after I'm done work, we all go for a walk together or go shoot some hoops on the driveway. So engaging in those family activities together in the afternoon can be helpful, and getting that academic educational time done in the morning.
This goes back to something that we were talking about at the very first hour this morning, but it's one that we're getting from many parents, so I think we'll ask it again. We're hearing from Leanda, who lives in New Brunswick, and says, believe it or not, there are still areas in her province and elsewhere that are not internet accessible. So her concern is, and her question is, what do you do, how do students learn if there is no technology available to them?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand that question. That's a big challenge. My recommendation for this is to go back to reading. Reading, whether it's
like
from a
books?
tablet or from a
Not
physical
books.
book. Yes, books, actual books, yes. And the reason why I recommend this is because getting children engaged in reading is actually a skill that will only continue to benefit them throughout their educational journey. So let the children choose any type of book that they're interested in, whatever you have on hand, and read to them, read with them, have them read on their own. But getting students to read for longer periods of time and having that attention and focus on reading is just as valuable and something that can be great right now.
But you know, you also made the point when we spoke about this earlier, it's probably worth repeating, that it's not just book learning that's important. There are other opportunities in day-to-day life around them, around us all, where there can be different kinds of learning.
Yes, exactly. And the examples that I gave earlier were cooking. Cooking is a great example that it can incorporate so many different elements, such as math, when you're doing the measurements for the recipes, following a recipe, even getting them to work on their writing by printing out a recipe or writing out a recipe, and then following the step-by-step directions, the process of how the cooking works. So that's a great life skill that can be built upon during this time. Taking walks through nature and learning different things about nature and outdoors can also be very valuable. So you have to be creative and think outside of the box if your technology is limited.
Eileen has a question, Joanne, about her daughter who's in grade 11, who has an IEP, an individual education plan, and she needs a teacher to keep her focused in the classroom, someone else working alongside. So struggles from reading. And this goes back again to a question that we've had from other parents as well this morning. So for kids with special learning needs, people with learning disabilities, how can they be accommodated at home?
Well, I think the answer to that is to get in contact with your child's school and with your child's teacher. I think in the coming weeks, they're going to be reaching out to us even more. We're going to get more correspondence as to what exactly is going to be happening. And there's many different ways for the teachers to differentiate the learning. So they can give everyone the same reading lesson, for example, but then have different questions or different assignments for the students based on their learning needs. And another thing they can do is also incorporate the use of assistive technology. So for example, they can use something like Texthelp Read and Write Gold, where it has a text-to-speech feature. So for students with a learning disability involving reading, then it can actually read it to them. So there's many different options, but I think the teachers also know their students well, and so they'll know what resources will be beneficial to their students and connect with the parents to make sure those are in place.